This is the Sea of Galilee. In the 1st century, dozens of fishing villages dotted its shores. On the northeast bank sat Bethsaida. It was here, sometime around the year 30 AD, that Jesus of Nazareth appeared and called his first disciples to his side.
As he was walking along the Sea of Galilee, he watched two brothers, Simon, now known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, casting a net into the sea. They were fishermen. He said to them, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men."
Philip, Peter, and Andrew may not have been the only apostles born in Bethsaida. In fact, some scholars argue as many as 8 of Jesus' early followers may have been natives of this one fishing village.
And this is amazing because today every third person in the world is Christian. And the 12 who spread Christianity came from this country, and perhaps 8 of them out of one single place. It is curious.
Bethsaida is also important because it was here that Jesus distinguished himself from John the Baptist.
Jesus did what John did not do. What John did not do was cast out demons and heal people. John proclaimed the coming of one who could do that.
When Jesus healed a blind man in Bethsaida, word spread quickly. Crowds gathered around Jesus, who, according to the Gospels, fed the growing multitudes with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. These events put Bethsaida at the center of the gospel narrative. Yet, despite its importance, by the 2nd century, Bethsaida was abandoned. Eventually, it disappeared from the map. For centuries, pilgrims and scholars searched in vain for the lost city, until some came to question its very existence. Then in 1838, American explorer Edward Robinson made a dramatic announcement. He'd found Bethsaida, buried under a mysterious sand dune named simply Et Tel, meaning the mound. But Robinson's claim had a fatal flaw.
There's a mound. It doesn't seem to be close enough to the Sea of Galilee, and so a number of the early explorers said, this can't be it, it's not on the water.
In fact, Et Tel sat a full 1.5 miles from the sea, much too far away from the water for a fishing village like Bethsaida. Over the following decades, as many as 10 locations for Bethsaida were suggested.
There were so many opinions about the location of Bethsaida. None of the scholars did a very simple thing and took a spade and excavated the sites to find out actually which is which. I managed to get a small group of students, and we went to look for the site of Bethsaida.
In 1987, Israeli archaeologist Rami Arav decided to dig at Et Tel. To his surprise, he found tantalizing ruins.
The only site that yielded remains from the 1st century was here on the mound, while the others were found to be much later in period. So they couldn't be Bethsaida. Bethsaida has to be contemporary with Jesus.
Scholars remained skeptical. Yet as Arav began to excavate Et Tel, he believed he'd not only found Bethsaida, but solid evidence of Jesus' presence here.
So this is the street that we discovered at Bethsaida. We were able to date it by the finds that we found on the street. They were largely 1st century finds. This is the only one authentic street that we know most assuredly that Jesus walked on.
Artifacts uncovered in the dig clearly dated this village to the 1st century, but the site's location continued to fuel doubts.
Now, the next question that came to our mind was, how come the city is located so far away from the seashore? But this is not an archaeological question. This question is a geological question.
Arav turned to geological experts who, after intensive on-site research, managed to solve the mystery.
Those who've studied it say that we can't take the present coastline of the Sea of Galilee as being the first century coastline. So it is possible that the site that Rami is excavating was on the water.
In fact, the shoreline of the Galilee had actually moved several miles over the centuries. Robinson had been right all along. Et Tel had once sat on the shore. The long-lost city of Bethsaida had finally been found. What followed was one of the most rewarding excavations ever conducted in the Holy Land.
This is the fisherman's house. We dubbed it the fisherman's house because this had plenty of fishing implements inside. This is the central courtyard pavement. And this is again the center of the house. Here the fishing nets were most probably hanged to be repaired and to be cleaned and to be prepared for the next day's fishing. Here would be also the rest of the family gathering.
Bethsaida literally means the house of fishermen. And true to its name, excavations here are providing invaluable insight into the lives of fishermen in Jesus' day.
You see the eye of the needle here. We have all kind of weights like this, all kind of types of weights made of stone and hooks. All these finds indicate that we are dealing with a very intensive fishing activity that took place at Bethsaida during the time of Jesus. And the reason gives an explanation to the number of references on fishing that occurs in the Gospels. And the reason is that Jesus was active around fishing communities.
Jesus' message is for all time. He's really talking specifically to people who had a certain mindset at a certain time. And you have to enter into their mindset and understand them. And I think one of the ways to do that is understanding the physical reality that was around them. And that's what archaeologists try to do.
And archaeologists have long known to fully understand the mindset of Jesus and his disciples, there is one place to go, down to the sea. There, an ancient craft slumbered unseen beneath the waves until an act of nature and a stroke of luck brought it to light. Could it be the very boat on which Jesus and his disciples sailed the Galilee? In the Gospels, there are 45 references to boats and fishing. Jesus himself used nautical metaphors and showed experience in seafaring. He even slept through a violent storm that terrified his fishermen companions.
They made their way toward him and woke him. "Lord, save us, we are lost." He said to them, "Where is your courage? How little faith you have."
Although the majority of Jesus' ministry took place around the Sea of Galilee, in the milieu of fishing and boats, scholars have known surprisingly little about the crafts of Jesus' day.
If you look at Christian art throughout the ages, depictions of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, what you'll see is that the boats that are painted in those depictions are entirely different. There's nothing similar between any two pictures. The reason being that nobody really had a clue as to what these boats looked like.
In fact, although there were at least 16 bustling ports and hundreds of vessels plying the Galilee in the first century, no ancient boat was ever found here. But in 1986, the waters of the Galilee were at historic lows, a result of a severe 3-year drought. Along the newly exposed shoreline, two brothers, Yuval and Moshe Lufan, set out to find an ancient boat, a dream they'd shared since childhood.
And one day, Moshe found a few ancient coins. So we started looking at the same spot, and we found a Roman ancient nail, and more followed. We cleaned the place and found a piece of wood that looked like a part from a boat. We got excited. We jumped and danced. We realized that we'd found a boat, but we didn't know if it's ancient or not.
The brothers immediately called the Israel Department of Antiquities, summoning archaeologist Shelley Waxman.
And they asked me, well, how can we know if this boat is ancient? I explained to them that up until the end of the Roman period, ships were built shell first, but the planks were put together with mortise and tenon joints rather than metal fasteners, and all we'd have to do is find those and we'd know whether it was ancient or not. I said, well, okay, where's the boat? And UV said, oh, you're standing on it. And I looked down and I see this line of wood basically in the mud. So I very carefully opened up this line of wood, and immediately we saw that there were mortise and tenon joints there, which meant it was clear that this was an ancient boat.
The archaeologist became excited and jumped to the air and told us that we had made history.
The mortise and tenon joints indicated the boat was old, but just how old? When a brief preliminary probe unearthed a first-century pot and oil lamp, it became clear the boat might date back to the time of Jesus, a potentially earth-shattering find.
And it was obvious to us at the Department of Antiquities that if we didn't really rush into the field and start excavating, even though we weren't ready for it, we could have a situation in which some farmer with a tractor and a shovel could destroy this boat literally in an hour.
With a hastily assembled team, Waxman began to dig on February 16, 1986. But he immediately faced a predicament. The wood of the boat was so severely waterlogged, it crumbled at the slightest touch. To address the problem, platforms were built allowing volunteers to lie on their stomachs and excavate the boat without actually touching it. Removing mud one handful at a time was a painstaking process, made more nerve-wracking when the lake began to return to normal levels. In a race against time, work continued around the clock for the first 48 hours. Then, an incoming storm made all efforts seem futile.
Because of the recent rains, the water had begun to creep towards the boat, and it was a couple meters away from the boat that morning when we got what is called a sharkia, an east wind, which is the worst wind that you can have on the lake. When we read about storms in the Gospels, they were probably caused by sharkias. We see this water slowly with these little waves coming towards the boat, and I thought, oh my God, what are we going to do now?
Waxman received a temporary reprieve when the Israeli government sent tractors to build protective dikes. But his troubles were far from over. Indeed, in the very act of excavating the boat, they were in danger of destroying it. Safely packed in mud, the boat had survived for 2,000 years. But now, with exposure to the atmosphere, the water inside the wood cells was evaporating, irreversibly shrinking the wood at an alarming rate.
So this was something obvious to me that we had to interdigitate with a conservator from the very beginning to make sure that we weren't making mistakes that would destroy the boat. And there was no going back here. If you made a mistake, that was it. And think about it, you're dealing with the only ancient boat in the Sea of Galilee.
Although in a normal dig, artifacts are sent to a conservator after the fact. In this case, excavation and preservation had to proceed hand in hand. Waxman turned to conservation expert Orna Cohen. She faced a daunting task.
Many times we had stages when we thought it's the end, the boat is going to disappear, disintegrate.
She was extremely pessimistic about the possibility of taking this boat and actually bringing it to a successful conclusion. I said, well, we don't have a choice. It's in our ballpark and we've got to take care of it.
Cohen rose to the challenge with innovative and untested techniques.
The wood was so soft and fragile that it actually couldn't hold its own weight. So we had to put a strength with fiberglass frame that we built on the spot and fill it up with a special foam. This packing technique was never used for ancient boat. It's very unusual, but we had to race time because the wood started to dry out and fall apart.
After 11 tense days and nights of excavation, the boat once again sailed the Galilee for the first time in 2,000 years.
as the boat just started moving, everybody started clapping and yelling, and it was really a very emotional experience. And to see that actually we had pulled this off when everyone said it was impossible was quite a relief.
A short trip across the lake brought the boat to the Yeagal Alone Museum, where it was quickly re-immersed in a tank built especially for it. And in a process that would take nearly 14 years, the water in the wood cells of the boat was gradually replaced with synthetic wax. Carbon-14 dating confirmed the vessel was in use during the 1st century, the period of Jesus' lifetime. But could this boat actually be the Jesus boat hyped by the media?
It's not impossible that this boat was either seen, touched, or used by Jesus, but that's not something that archaeology can determine.
I think initially people thought the boat was very exciting because you could see that it could fit 12 people quite comfortably, 12 plus an oarsman. That's 13. That's exactly what's portrayed in the Gospels. So many people tried to use the boat as a means to confirm the Gospel stories. I don't think the point is too well made. I think what the boat shows, rather, is the socioeconomics of the Galilee.
Indeed, a close study of the boat revealed 2 fascinating details. One, that it had been kept afloat with decades of repeated repairs. And 2, that it was made of 12 different kinds of wood.
Most of the wood was inferior jujube, willow, or pine, and very little of it was of high-quality wood, such as cedar. And in fact, those pieces of cedar that were used on this boat had been used on previous boats. And when the boat finally could no longer be kept afloat, the nails and other reusable parts were removed and taken and used on a subsequent boat, and the boat was then pushed out and left to sink.
And when you see this hull, you realize that the person who built this boat was extremely poor. And you have to remember, whoever owned this boat was not at the bottom of the food chain. This is somebody who, for example, in the Gospels could have hired men work with him and get part of the payment in fish. So we're talking about someone who is higher up in the scale, but even so, he's very, very poor.
The incredible discovery of the Galilee boat opened a rare window to the past. But just as the sea was giving up its buried treasure, only miles away, an incredible faith-affirming discovery was about to be revealed in the Holy Land. Was this the house of St. Peter? After calling his first disciples from Bethsaida, Jesus lived an itinerant life, preaching and healing among the fishing villages of the Galilee. But if it could be said he had a base of operations anywhere, it was in Capernaum.
It's an interesting fact that Jesus grows up in Nazareth in the hill country, close to a big city, Sepphoris, but does not choose to begin his ministry in Nazareth. He did choose Capernaum. You have to wonder why. My speculation would be that it was on a major road, and Jesus, as an itinerant teacher, is going to have to travel, and he needs ease of travel.
In between preaching missions, Jesus returned to Capernaum, where he lived with the family of his disciple, Peter. The Gospels say that in Peter's house, Jesus performed countless healings. At one point, the crowds there became so large, the desperate friends of a paralytic man dug through the roof and lowered their stricken friend down to Jesus.
The sociologists of antiquity estimate that perhaps as many as 20 or even 25% of the Palestinian population at any given time was sick or in some way infirm. Jesus then becomes a one-man HMO, and people are mobbing, trying to get at him. And so that's a very plausible scenario. Jesus inside the house, no way to get to him. So what do? You take off a piece of the roof and lower your sick friend down right into Jesus' lap.
Even after Jesus' death, Capernaum remained a center for his followers. In the 5th century, the pilgrim Egeria visited this community and recorded that the house of St. Peter had been transformed into a church. But sometime during the 8th century, Capernaum was abandoned and forgotten. Then in 1838, biblical scholar Edward Robinson came upon a tribe of Bedouins living in tents amongst magnificent ruins.
I noticed the prostrate ruins of an edifice, which for expense, labor, and ornament surpasses anything we have yet seen in Palestine.
60 years after Robinson identified these ruins as the synagogue of ancient Capernaum, the Franciscan custodians of Bethlehem, Nazareth, and other holy sites purchased a large surrounding area from the Bedouin. In excavations between 1905 and 1991, the Franciscans unearthed much of the first century village, with streets, alleys, storefronts, and houses.
Here we have many other houses from the village of Capernaum. It's very close to the sea, to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and they were fishermen.
These finds provided invaluable context for Jesus' mission. But it was one discovery in particular that sent ripples through the Christian world. Only 30 feet from the ancient synagogue stood the ruins of an octagonal 5th century Byzantine church. When the Franciscans dug beneath the church, what they found astonished them.
We are in the house which was excavated by archaeologists some 30 years ago. So the surprise for the archaeologists was to find a more ancient house-like church beneath the octagonal Byzantine church.
The Franciscans suspected this room once served as a church because it contained no signs of domestic activity such as ashes or kitchenware. In addition, unlike any other room in Capernaum, its walls were plastered.
In there were found also small pieces of plaster with religious graffitis on it, with the name of Jesus many times, with prayers to Jesus as a God.
Archaeologists observed striking similarities between this place and the one described by 5th century pilgrim Egeria.
What Egeria says is that there was a church, but in this church, the walls of the ancient house were preserved. And this is exactly the situation which our archaeologists have found beneath the octagonal church in Capernaum. They found a house which was transformed into a church.
In fact, digging deeper beneath the house church revealed a simple home, with rooms grouped around a courtyard. Coins, pottery, and lamps found here dated the house to the 1st century, and fishing implements indicated it was occupied by fishermen. Could this have been the very house of St. Peter?
Of all of the traditional holy sites, St. Peter's house at Capernaum is the one that I think is most likely. And the reason for that is that archaeology shows that in the 1st century, it was a very, very simple peasant fishing house. But as early as the end of the 2nd century, the house, portions of it get plastered. It begins to look as though one room in the house is deemed special. And later in the late 2nd through 3rd century, you have graffiti scratched into the wall and onto the floors. And this is exceptionally rare. And it all happens before the 4th century. It's possible that you have a historical memory of an important site to Christianity going back to the time of Jesus.
The Franciscans contend 2nd century Christians honored St. Peter by converting his house into a place of worship. Today, the Franciscans continue the tradition with a modern-day church atop the ruins. But not all scholars are convinced of the veracity of the site. In particular, some archaeologists contend the church was built no earlier than the 4th century.
I don't think the dating has been done correctly. All the plaster of the walls of this house church has graffiti written in Greek. It is not written in Palestinian Jewish Aramaic, which you would expect if it had come from an earlier time from Jewish Christians living in Capernaum. Greek is the language of pilgrims coming there. The excavators, they looked at some of the examples of the graffiti on the walls of this house, and they said it was Aramaic. When I looked at it, I turned the pieces around and realized they'd read upside down Greek and identified this as Aramaic. It's just not very well done archaeology, in my opinion.
Although scholars debate the house of St. Peter, archaeology here may actually prove the accuracy of a gospel story long thought apocryphal. The story of the paralytic lowered through the roof of St. Peter's house.
You can't build a large unsupported roof out of stone. And so these houses, in fact, did have roofs that were built out of mud and branches and that kind of thing. And so the story in the Gospels about digging a hole in the roof to get down, in fact, is perfectly compatible with the archaeology that's been done there.
I don't know of any incident in the Gospels where archaeology shows that Jesus could not have done that, or that Jesus certainly did not say that. It's the other way around. Archaeology time and time again shows that there really was such a place, or that this activity that the Gospels were talking about did take place, and this could have happened. Archaeology neither proves nor disproves. What archaeology does is clarify.
Near the house of St. Peter stand the ruins of the synagogue of Capernaum. Many believe this 5th century structure sits atop a 1st century synagogue, the place where, according to the Gospels, Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath.
Jesus' miracles were controversial to many because he was perceived as crossing a line. He was working on the Sabbath, and he should not be. He would tell people that their sins were forgiven. And some of his contemporaries wondered, well, by what right does he do that? This is something that only God can do through his priest. But who's this Jesus forgiving people their sins and healing people on the Sabbath?
As Jesus' controversial ministry neared completion, these were the questions on many people's minds. Who was Jesus? Who did he claim to be? Was he a prophet? A heretic? A revolutionary? Could he be the long-awaited Messiah?
If somebody in the 1st century said Messiah, what you would expect was some sort of a military leader who would offset in the name of God the injustice and the violence of Roman control. You'd look at Jesus and say, well, you don't see a sword, you don't see any sign of violence, so I don't think myself that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah.
Jesus was crucified as the King of the Jews. Why did the Romans think of him as the King of the Jews? The best explanation is that his own following believed that he was the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed of the Lord, the true King of Israel. And Jesus allowed them to believe that.
But did Jesus actually say he was the Messiah? Or was the idea introduced later by the authors of the Gospels? A possible answer lay buried in the vast deserts of Egypt, but only an accident would divulge it. In December 1945, Muhammad Ali, an Egyptian farmer, went to the cliffs of Jabal et Tarif, some 6 miles northwest of the city of Nag Hammadi. While digging for fertilizer, Ali's shovel hit something hard, a sealed and obviously ancient storage jar.
And so he broke open the jar, and he said that, in fact, there was gold inside of the jar. And the gold came out of the jar, and it lingered in the air, sparkling in the air as gold in the air, and then flew off to Allah in heaven. Muhammad Ali looked for more gold in the jar, and there was no more gold there, just old books, old dusty books. What he saw as gold were likely pieces of papyrus, golden in color and glistening in the sun, that then blew away.
Sorely disappointed, Muhammad Ali took the jar home, put it in a corner, and forgot about it. Yet eventually, the manuscripts found their way to Cairo. And when the 13 codices now known as the Nag Hammadi Library were finally made available to scholars, they were instantly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds of all time. In particular, scholars were electrified by the presence of a gospel among the ancient texts. For this crumbling papyrus was not a copy of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but a long-lost work bearing the title, The Gospel of Thomas.
These are the secret words that the living Jesus spoke, and Judas Thomas the twin wrote down. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings shall not taste death.
The Gospel of Thomas is a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Some 70 of them have parallels or near parallels in the canonical Gospels of the New Testament. But their similarities end.
The Gospel of Thomas is extremely important because it's very, very distinct from the 4 that we have in the New Testament, all of which are narrative Gospels. They're stories. Here we have a collection of sayings of Jesus. There's no birth story, there's no passion story, there's no post-resurrection apparitions, there's no stories except some parables.
Jesus said, I shall give you what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and no hand has touched, and what has not come into the human heart.
How do you interpret these sayings of Jesus? If we have in churches gospels already, then what about this gospel that sometimes today is called a fifth gospel? What kind of authority might that have? And therein lies the controversy that began early on and continues to the present day.
At the heart of the Thomas controversy is the question of its date. Although the papyrus found in Nag Hammadi dates to the 4th century, some scholars contend the original may have been written as early as 50 AD, a full 2 decades before the earliest canonical Gospels.
If the Gospel of Thomas is to be given an early date, then it may be that in a lot of ways, the Gospel of Thomas got it right in terms of Jesus. And we may have to take the Gospel of Thomas much more seriously as a source that can give us some profound insight into who the historical Jesus was and what he might have said.
I think the Gospel of Thomas is very challenging to Christians because when you read it, there are many sayings that you would like to agree with and find very interesting and provocative. Yet it's not part of the traditional Christian canon, and it throws the whole concept of the canon and canonization into question.
In fact, if Thomas was written within 20 years of the crucifixion, as some scholars contend, it may be the most authentic record of the words actually spoken by Jesus. But others reject this early dating as mere wishful thinking.
I wish we had many other Gospels and sources besides Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that could tell us something about Jesus, but I'm afraid Thomas is not one of them. The reason I say this is that when we compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see how Matthew and Luke sometimes improve upon Mark's wording. We find those improvements in Thomas. So what does that tell us? It suggests that Thomas is a secondary collection dating from the 2nd century.
Whether composed in the 1st or 2nd century, there is little dispute that Thomas is old enough to have been included in the New Testament canon. Yet it wasn't. Was this an error of omission or a deliberate exclusion? The answer may lie in the stark contrasts between Thomas and the canonical Gospels.
The 4 New Testament Gospels are all Gospels of the cross, but the Gospel of Thomas is not. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is not presented as the Son of the Virgin Mary. Jesus performs no physical miracles. He does not die for anybody's sins, and he does not rise from the dead on Easter Sunday. The Gospel of Thomas is a different kind of gospel. It's a gospel of wisdom
In fact, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is portrayed as a sage. He is called teacher or master instead of Lord, Son of God, or Christ. But in its most startling departure from the New Testament, Thomas never refers to Jesus as the crucified Messiah.
The Gospel of Thomas is very important because it shows that there was a group of Christians who thought that Jesus was important not so much as the Messiah, but because he was a teacher of wisdom.
Is it possible that Thomas represents an early yet abandoned vein of Christian thought? Was this gospel not truly lost, but instead suppressed by an early church struggling to define its orthodoxy?
If Jesus is understood first and foremost as a teacher of wisdom, then what about the cross? If in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus doesn't die for anybody's sins, then what about the cross? What about the centrality of the cross in Christian thinking to the present day? This indeed is one of the reasons why the Gospel of Thomas is powerful and troubling as people think about it.
Even in Jesus' time, there must have been more than one way to interpret the terrible events that were about to unfold. With the Passover festival fast approaching, Jesus left the Galilee for the last time and headed for Jerusalem. A terrible fate awaited him. But according to the Gospels, first he would perform one of his greatest miracles, raising a man from the dead. Around the year 30 AD, Jesus and his disciples made a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But with the city thronging with Passover crowds, Jesus quickly withdrew to Bethany, a small village just 2 miles away.
When the pilgrims came to Jerusalem, the population of the city tripled. It went from about 50,000 to about 150,000. That meant space in the city was at a premium, prices went through the roof, and poor workmen like Jesus of Nazareth could not afford to stay in the city. That's why he had a sort of a standing arrangement in Bethany, just on the other side of the Mount of Olives, with the family of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus.
In Bethany, Jesus reputedly cured Simon the leper, one of by now dozens of healings reported not only by the Gospels, but even by the Jewish historian Josephus.
At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure.
But of all of his startling deeds, the most earth-shattering was yet to come.
Any great healer always has the healings escalate steadily. I don't find it in any way surprising that Jesus, first of all, raises Jairus' daughter from her deathbed, maybe, that next we hear him in Luke's gospel raising somebody being brought on the bier to the tomb, and finally in John's gospel he takes somebody out of the tomb. Of course, that is the normal escalation of any healer. A healer brings life out of death.
According to the Gospels, the culmination of Jesus' healing miracles occurred in Bethany. After a 4-day absence in Jerusalem, Jesus returned to the home of Mary and Martha, and the grievous news, their brother Lazarus was dead. Jesus immediately went to the place where 4 days earlier, Lazarus had been laid to rest. He commanded the mourners to remove the stone from the tomb.
He called loudly, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, bound hand and foot with linen strips, his face wrapped in a cloth. "Untie him," Jesus told them, "and let him go free."
The raising of Lazarus is clearly one of the most dramatic stories in the Gospels. But can archaeology shed any light on its historical veracity?
There are a couple of places where details in the story conform quite closely to the archaeological evidence for Jewish burial practices. For example, the story says that the tomb was a cave and that a stone lay upon it. Now that fits very nicely with what we find in the archaeological records. In addition, All of our rabbinic sources speak of wrapping and binding of the body at the time of death. And so the command of Jesus, untie him and let him go, also fits with what we know of typical Jewish burial practices in that place and time.
In addition, in the 19th century, Franciscan excavations in Bethany revealed a 4th century church next to a rock-cut tomb. These finds confirmed the accounts of early pilgrims who reported visiting a church built next to what they believed to be the grave of Lazarus.
The tomb of Lazarus is still venerated in the village of Bethany. In fact, its Arabic name is Lazarie, Lazarion in Greek, the place of Lazarus. And in fact, the tomb was part of the cemetery of the 1st century. The village was further up the hill. It has been excavated by the Franciscans. There's certainly no doubt of occupation in the 1st century.
Yet, some scholars argue the venerated tomb does not conform to other 1st century graves. There are no platforms, benches, or niches typical of Jewish tombs of the era. Yet, even if this were a 1st century tomb, it would not be possible to identify it as the tomb of Lazarus.
In general, archaeology paints a picture that is very much in line with what you find in the Gospels. The problem is that what Christians really want are faith-related issues. Was Jesus really the Messiah? Was he really born of a virgin? Was he really able to heal people? Did he really do miracles on the Sea of Galilee? And these are things that archaeology simply can't confirm, and it also can't deny.
In the end, neither archaeology nor any other science can prove or disprove the resurrection of Lazarus, nor any of the events of the world-transforming years when Jesus walked the Galilee. Did Jesus truly walk on water and feed the multitudes in Bethsaida? Did he give sight to the blind, and in Capernaum, make the lame to walk again? And finally, did Jesus truly rise from his grave? It is, and always has been, a matter of faith.